Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to Socialism versus Capitalism, a Niagara debate. First and foremost, I'd like to direct your attention to the YouTube chat where there is a poll posted. The question is, which system do you think is superior? The options are capitalism, socialism, and undecided. I'll give you a few minutes to complete the poll. We'll take a look at the results, and then at the end of the debate, we'll do the poll again to see how results vary. While you're doing that, I'll introduce today's topic. First off, my name is Vijay Kumar, and I'll be today's moderator. Today's events will be, as the name suggests, a debate on the merits between two oft juxtaposed economic systems. The adage goes, it is easier to envision the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Mark Fisher wrote in his magnum opus, Capitalist Realism, about how truly ubiquitous capital had become to the point of invading the ways in which we engage with culture. Francis Fukuyama proclaimed that the end of history had come, following the collapse of the Berlin Wall. There was an assumption that our material concerns had been resolved. We were entering a state of post-materialism. Life would now be about the finer nuances of life, be it social justice, environmentalism, and insofar as there existed economic distress like poverty or inequality, it was merely a cosmetic problem, and the answer involved some subtle reform to the ways in which we engage our institutions. Capitalism, after all, has lifted billions out of poverty. It has been the reason why the world has achieved the innovations it has. Shouldn't we protect it? Indeed, it is difficult to envision anything other than capitalism. Enter socialism, or rather the renewed interest in socialism, with the rise of the squad, as it were, Bernie Sanders, the achievements of economies in Scandinavia and in the Nordic region, and countries with massive social safety nets. There has been a renewed interest in Marxism, socialism, and in general critiques of capitalism. Even among the traditional right, we see an opposition to the Reagan, Clinton, Blair consensus, or as it is more popularly called, neoliberalism. Socialism is a term that describes collective ownership as opposed to individual ownership. As many capitalist variations there are also varying approaches to socialism. Market socialism is thought of as the best way to marry the best parts of capitalism with the best parts of socialism. With that being said, however, there are some socialists who believe that there cannot be a marriage at all. Rosa Luxemburg, for example, thought that reforms to capitalism just delayed the inevitable. Unions, after all, don't address the antagonism between capital and labor. The relationship is inherently exploitative, and our anxieties will only increase. So with that, I think it is a good time to finish up the poll. So please, if you haven't completed it, take the next few seconds to do so. And I'll give it a few seconds before we take a look at the results. All right, so the results are in. We have 45% of the vote in favor of socialism, about 35% undecided, and 20% in favor of capitalism. Very interesting. So we will revisit this poll at the end, but with this context, I would like to introduce our debaters. Representing socialism, Colin Bruce Anthes is a Niagara-based artist, educator, and activist. His artistic work focuses on collaborative forms of performance creation, while his political work centers on industrial democracy and building community wealth. He will be arguing in favor of socialism. Benjamin Hersche grew up in Regina, Saskatchewan, and he is studying kinesiology at Brock University. He has plans to pursue subsequent degrees in education. Ben is a member of the Brock Campus Conservatives, and today he is arguing in favor of a capitalist economy. Before we begin, I would like to remind the debaters about the structure of the debate. First, we'll have 15-minute introductions, a 10-minute rebuttal, a 15-minute collective discussion, and then 5-minute closing statements. So please keep within the time limit. And I will remind you when you have about 30 seconds left and give you a heads up when to finish your final points. And with that, I would like to invite Colin Bruce Anthes to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Benjamin. And thank you to Brock Campus Conservatives. I'm going to begin by talking about psychology. Psychologists have found we are enormously influenced by what are called framing effects. Basically, the way a question is asked is greatly influential over the way we tend to answer that question. For instance, in Denmark, only 6% of the population had signed up to have their bodies donated to science in the event of their death as of a handful of years ago. While in neighboring Norway, over 80% of the population had, and in both cases, citizens could simply check a box to determine the outcome. So here we saw two neighboring countries answering the same question, as if they were different species. When researchers dug a bit deeper, however, they found the explanation was very simple. In Denmark, they had a default position of your body will not be donated to science, but citizens could check a box to change from the default position. In Norway, they had a default of your body will be donated to science. They'd actually answered the question very similarly, in that only a tiny number of people had changed from their default positions. They just had different starting places. Now, what's very interesting, and I suspect we shall find very telling about this topic, is that right now in the United States, among other major nations, millennials report having a higher favorability rating of socialism than they do of capitalism, with other older demographics catching up quickly. It would be an understatement to say this is happening in countries for which socialism is not the default position. This is happening in countries that were on the other side of the Cold War, whose major media outlets are capitalist corporations that get their revenue by running advertisements by other capitalist corporations, and whose citizens are hit with between 6,000 and 10,000 capitalist advertisements a day, and are 40 years into full-on neoliberal capitalism. Everyone in these societies should be signing up for capitalism, unless, to be blunt, there's something really wrong with it. I'm going to ask you to look at this question from a different starting point. It's going to be easy. I'm going to describe to you a society that's almost exactly the same as the one you're in now. Banks you use for finance the same way you use your present bank. A market sector of the same size, with independent companies regulated by supply and demand. A government of the same size, elected the same way, focused on the same basic public benefits. But some of those enterprises are structured a little differently. And I want you to imagine that those structural changes took place in the 1890s. Why the 1890s? Because they very nearly were. Around 1870, we moved from a small business economy, family farms, local shops, the butcher, the baker, the tinker, the tailor, to a big business economy, what we call corporate capitalism. And in the 1870s and the 1890s, the capitalist world had enormous economic crashes called panics, which gives you a sense of what they were like. These, of course, were precursors to the Great Depression and world wars of the early 20th century. In response to these crises, different modes of organizing production and finance became a lot more common. They worked really well. They had above average rates of success then, they continue to exist today, and they continue to have above average rates of success in contemporary practice. But they've always been primarily organized by poor people who do not control the investment of society. And so they never became the dominant mode of doing things. I want you to imagine that in the 1890s, they became the dominant mode of doing things, so that this is the world you were born into. This is what you grew up in. The banks are not corporate banks. Corporate banks, as you're probably aware, try to maximize profits for their owners by collecting as much in interest as possible. In Canada, most of our largest corporations are corporate banks. That's a big part of the reason why, prior to COVID, household debt in this country, credit cards, student loans, car loans, mortgages, your kind of debt, was $1.80 for every dollar of disposable income the average citizen possessed, and rising fast. Instead of corporate banks, you have a decentralized series of credit unions and public banks. Many of you may already belong to credit unions. They're very popular. They have 240 million members around the world. But for those who do not know, as I didn't growing up, a credit union is an independent bank, but it's a cooperative bank. It's owned by its members, the people who bank there. The primary reason they're deemed to be so much more friendly in their communities is simply that they are not incentivized the same way to write crazy things in the fine print to try to get you. You'd be ripping yourself off. Public banks, we actually used to have a version of across this country. You used to be able to do your basic banking through the post office, but the corporate banks lobbied that away in, I believe, the 1970s. But don't let anybody tell you that Alberta doesn't like socialism. In Alberta, right now, one of their most successful enterprises is their $50 billion public bank. So you have a bit more say as to where the investment goes. Your pensions aren't tied to the military industrial complex. Your banks aren't up to their eyeballs in fraud. They're not creating millions of fake bank accounts the way Wells Fargo did. Those things are different. But the way you actually use your bank and what you use it for is exactly the same. Your corporations are companies like the John Lewis Partnership. John Lewis is a British retail giant. They're one of the biggest retail companies in all of Europe. You may have encountered them at Christmas. Their Christmas commercials often go viral. Elton John going back through time, through his various pianos, until he gets his first keyboard Christmas morning as a little boy, that sort of thing. Almost 100 years ago, the John Lewis Partnership was handed down to its employees by a progressive entrepreneur. At least prior to COVID, it had grown to 85,000 employees. They all own shares in the company. And every 3 years, they democratically elect their division representatives to a workers' council in much the same way a city of 85,000 elects its ward representatives to a city council. And when the company turns a profit, as it usually does, a portion of that profit gets reinvested into the company to continue its success, and a portion gets redistributed to the entire workforce that produced that profit in the form of a company bonus. It's a democratic enterprise. In addition to democratic enterprise, you have various kinds of member and consumer cooperatives. I've mentioned credit unions, but you're probably also familiar with things like food cooperatives, housing cooperatives, solar cooperatives, internet cooperatives. Around the world right now, there are 1 billion members of cooperatives. Not because there's a huge marketing campaign to get people into them. There isn't. But because as enterprises, they have above average rates of success. And for the individuals using those enterprises, they are coherently organized in their interest. And then you have your democratically elected governments using clearly progressive forms of taxation to pay for basic, popular public benefits around healthcare, education, infrastructure, public parks, libraries, firefighters, that sort of thing. That's it. That's what you were born into. That's what you grew up in. Then there's a referendum. You can now switch from this to capitalism. And capitalism is described as capitalism. Capitalists often don't like to talk about capitalism. They like to talk about markets, which are not and never have been capitalism. Markets predate capitalism by millennia. You probably remember from your high school history courses. The ancient Greeks had markets. In the 1890s, capitalism was a very new system in the few places where it existed at all, brought about by the Enclosures Acts in Great Britain, which threw citizens off 7 million acres of land held in common, often onto the streets, with dissenters commonly shot or thrown into forced forms of labor as the property was handed over to the moneyed classes with military force. In this new system, the workers were now the capital investments of the owners of enterprise, so that the vast majority of workers now found themselves organized from above to labor for the profits of the owners. That specifically is what you can switch to by checking a box. Hundreds of thousands of low-wage workers in warehouses, undemocratically organized from above to make Jeffrey Bezos another $100 billion. Not only can you switch to that, you can pass that down to your kids. Now ask yourself, and ask yourself honestly, because this isn't about me, it's not about my opponent, this is not a contest of egos, this is about you. Would you check that box? If your answer is no, and it may well be hell no, note that we are done here. We can discuss the difficulties of changing things, but as regards the topic, if you would not check that box, there's nothing to debate. So with my remaining time, there are two key points I want to drive home. The first is everyone should be some kind of socialist. It's perfectly good and reasonable that we should debate the size of government, how much regulation is necessary, how taxation should be done. None of that has to do with capitalism versus socialism. Capitalism is not markets. Socialism is not government control. Capitalism is a division of workers and owners in which the workers are organized from above to labor for the profits of the owners. Socialism is everything that pertains to worker control of production, the working class in charge of its own affairs, and the working class getting all the wealth that it produces. That absolutely can include democratically elected governments organizing public benefits, but it also includes democratic enterprise, cooperative enterprise, and grassroots community organization. From a totally planned economy to a totally free market economy, capitalism need not enter the conversation. It is a system handed down from a pre-democratic era that never had a place in the conversation about a democratic society, and certainly has no place in the 21st century. The second point is that socialism is elementary common sense. Now, this might sound like a repeat of the first, but what I mean is that while a huge amount of money has been spent giving people the impression that capitalism, whatever its faults, is the Western individualist tradition, and socialism would be the enemy of Western individualism. Certainly, Jordan Peterson has leaned heavily into that impression to create his internet phenomenon. As we move into the industrial era, with huge machines and massive corporations, with thousands of workers in highly divided forms of labor, the notion that we had to move from a capitalist mode of production to a democratic one, just as our political systems were moving to ones in which each individual was enfranchised with the right to vote, was the Western individualist tradition from grassroots groups to practically every one of the leading Western individualist thinkers. Whether we're talking about the Knights of Labor, who considered themselves Republican Americans, arguing for self-governance in politics and self-governance in the workplace, and had 750,000 members by the 1880s. Or John Stuart Mill, author of On Liberty and Principles of Political Economy, who said that if we are to expect continuous human progress, the organizers of enterprise ought to be elected by and accountable to the people who did the work in those enterprises. Or John Dewey, the leading American pragmatist, who spent his whole career arguing that democracy was not in practice what it was in name until it was industrial as well as civil and political. Or Bertrand Russell, the Nobel Prize winning face of the Western individualist tradition, who said capitalism and the wage system are twin monsters eating up the life of the world and must be abolished, and that one very significant step would be to render democratic the governance of every organization. Or George Orwell, who said socialism is elementary common sense and blatantly obvious. If the structures and practices that I described to you did not sound radical, it's because I don't have a radical bone in my body. I am a raging moderate. I just don't take the Amazon economy as my starting point. But you're going to have to work very hard to think for yourself, because Jeffrey Bezos collected $13 billion in one day. And when Jeff Bezos gives 1/13 of what he collected in one day to capitalist causes, like, for instance, politicians in the Democratic Party, so there is no alternative, that is equivalent to 30,000 median level employees donating an entire year's salary each to a working class cause, which of course they cannot do. So you will never see this argued fairly in the mainstream. You're going to leave this debate and you're going to continue to be saturated by an illegitimate conversation over an illegitimate spectrum of options. You don't have billions of dollars, you just have what's up here and what you talk about with those around you. So whatever you do, do not let go of that question. Would you check that box? Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Ben, you have a maximum of 15 minutes and you may begin now.
All right. Well, I'll obviously leave most of my response to what Colin said to the rebuttal, but I will start with this. What most of the countries that he has mentioned, Canada, Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, do not claim to be socialist. Those are simply just, they may have government subsidies or government programs or certain benefits, but those are only afforded through capitalist and a free market economy. I'm not quite sure why you removed the markets from the conversation of capitalism, but that is part of it. You know, I have a quote here. The Danish president Lars Rasmussen, or they might have a different pronunciation, I don't know, said in 2015, he said, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist plan economy. Denmark is a market economy, the free market, which is what we're talking about. And, you know, you also started with the framing of the question. So let's start with the framing of the question. The question that was posed today was, which is the better economic system, socialism or capitalism? With the subpoints that were given to me is, which is more ethical, produces more wealth and prosperity. I'd argue that capitalism has far and away provided that. And my case study is the Western world, one of the most successful civilizations in history, almost, I would say. And sorry, I just need a little time to think. I'm a little muddled. What exactly is your definition of socialism? I guess we'll make this more clear in the rebuttal. But my understanding of it is a more centralized form of labor distribution and labor distribution and goods, how that is produced, how is that distributed. And capitalism is more, like we said, free market and independent of that. And capitalism through the free market, through these competitive markets, and not having as much centralization as socialism, has provided the very benefits of today. Like, look at what we're doing now. Zoom was made in the US, you know, our computers were all made in capitalist countries. They certainly weren't made in Venezuela. They certainly weren't made in North Korea. They certainly weren't made in those socialist countries, fully socialist countries. And if you want to argue how we can better spend, how the government can spend money, or how, what should be paid for through the free market, and maybe what should be paid for through individuals, that can be an argument, but that's an argument that can only be argued in the window of capitalism, because certainly socialism in of itself, a fully socialist system, which is what we're talking about, systems, could never provide that and has never provided that. Through the capitalist market, through capitalism in the US and in Europe, and in Canada, the very countries you mentioned, we have like innovation like you wouldn't believe. The 20th century and the 21st century have absolutely boomed the in the technology and institutions we can have. You know, you have things like Apple versus Microsoft, you know, having better, faster phones and technology through that sort of competition. If it was a purely socialist planned economy, you just have one of those and it would be okay, and it'd be very stagnant, and there would be no incentive to better it. And then another example of this is, I know you hate to talk about people like Bezos or like Musk, but you know, Elon Musk beat NASA at the very thing they're meant to do. He made a rocket that can go up and go back to Earth without exploding and wasting millions, maybe billions of dollars. And he did that through the free market and of his own research and doing, and his company. Obviously, it's not just him, it's a team. It's not like he was out in his backyard with a wrench. That'd be cool, but no. And again with Elon Musk, his tenacity with making Tesla has now incentivized other car companies to make more affordable and producible electric cars and electric trucks even. And again, if it was a socialist plan economy, why, like, there would be no competition. There would just be the same thing over and over again. And it also gives the individual power to do whatever they would like. They can work for a big company. They can work for the government if they want. In the socialists, you'd be working for the huge companies and whatever, or you can even start your own business if you want. You can do that. You can, lots of online opportunities. I think, and you mentioned Jeff Bezos, I think that's a huge example of what happens when, you know, a centralized power, aka the government, just kind of shuts down everything and doesn't allow any small businesses or any sort of free market, really. Like, this isn't a COVID debate, but it's certainly something to know that when the government completely shut down and had control over what opened and what wasn't, the rich got much richer and the poor got much poorer. I don't think that that's something to be ignored. You can say it's for a good reason. You can say it's because of a health pandemic or whatever, but certainly the shutdown of small business and taking power away from the individual makes the rich richer and the poor poor. And, you know, and it was through capitalism and competition that, speaking still on the COVID thing, is what made the very vaccines we have today. It was, you know, what was it? Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson. Obviously, those latter two were a little problematic, but still they were made. Pfizer and biotech was German and American. Moderna, I think, was American. AstraZeneca was British, and Johnson & Johnson was American. All those were capitalist countries, especially the US, one of the leading powerhouses of an example of what a capitalist economy can do. And it seems, and we don't even have to look as far as these big countries, these well-established countries like Canada, like the US, like Europe. Those are very old countries, and they've had a lot of time ahead to produce the very goods. If you want to look at how capitalism really benefits its people, you can look at Africa. There's countries like Botswana, I believe Nigeria, and they've produced once they were away from British rule, for example, in Botswana, I believe they broke from British rule sometimes in the 50s or 60s. They had a president, and they introduced a free market economy where taxes were low, and it was business pro policy. And it is one of the most profitable and one of the most wealthiest nations in that section of Africa. Much better than most of the socialist countries that Africa has. And honestly, I'll also just end off where socialism is just the history of it too, honestly. Like you said, I don't think you really mentioned the atrocities of Russia, of Soviet Russia, of communist China, Pol Pot in Cambodia with his killing fields. And in the 20th century, socialism absolutely brought destruction and chaos to every country it touched. And we're talking about socialism as a system. You can argue whether things should be subsidized or whatever, but that can only be achieved through capitalism and a free market economy. Otherwise, you get atrocities. And if you can name a socialist country that has produced more freedom, more wealth, and more prosperity than capitalism, I'd be happy to hear it. But I'm just not hearing that from your argument, Colin. But yeah, so I'll end off there.
All right, thank you, Ben. We will now enter the 10-minute rebuttal portion of the debate. And Colin, I'll ask you to go first. I think a recurring theme, however, in the chat from what I've read is definitional. So if we could spend maybe just a few moments on defining terms, what is capitalism, what is socialism, I think that would be beneficial. But Colin, the floor is yours. We have 10 minutes.
Absolutely. Great, thank you. Let me first off say I'm glad that you were opposed to monopoly, or it sounded like you were opposed to monopoly. We have common ground there, absolutely. In terms of Scandinavia, you're correct that it's not a totally socialist set of economies, certainly not totally a set of planned economies. However, we are talking about countries in which the state owns 60% of the wealth. Denmark, 50% of the wealth is owned by the state. Over 65% of the Scandinavian workforce is unionized. And in Finland, there are more members of cooperatives than there are people, because the average adult belongs to multiple cooperatives. So they're much more socialist than people think they are. However, I have to get back to the definitions, as Vijay said. Capitalists like to talk about markets, not about the relation of capital. Anything that belongs to worker control of production, the working class in charge of its own affairs, and the working class getting all the wealth that it produces, belongs to socialist movements. There have been anarchist movements that wanted no government at all that were socialist movements. That's the original definition of libertarian. So you have heard the common discourse about markets, and that has confused you on a great many issues. Now, you have, as of right now, not made an argument for capitalism. You have made an argument for markets. Now, if there are counters to the points that you've made, for instance, you ascribe a huge amount of innovation to capitalism that actually came through publicly funded research and development, especially through the United States military, and specifically because that kind of long-term research and development was so incompatible with models of short-term profit maximization. Everything that makes the smartphone smart was developed through publicly funded research and development. It is very hard not to be anti-capitalist on your iPhone, especially if you're using the touchscreen technology to access your GPS, to use the internet to figure out which public roads to drive down. But I actually don't need to make any of those counters at all. You have not articulated why your arguments are arguments for specifically capitalist markets with a division of workers and owners, not markets for democratic and cooperative enterprise. Why are you arguing for Amazon and against Mondragon? The principles you've articulated seem to be much more in keeping with Mondragon than Amazon. And the commodities that you're bragging about have been produced in an economy that for ordinary people has been a precarious basket case for 15 years. If you want to argue for market capitalism and not market socialism specifically, you have to argue that the prosperity capitalism produces is so great and the downside and risks are so small that if you had the basic democratic rights in the places in which you work, that you already expect as citizens in the places in which you live, you should give them up in order to obtain what Adam Smith called a master. If you would not give up democratic conditions for capitalist conditions, by definition, socialism is better than capitalism. Then it's just a question of what kind of socialism appeals to you the most personally. So, does capitalism produce anywhere close to that level of prosperity and security? Let's begin with the question of prosperity, which has meant a lot to you, Ben. Certainly it is true that there have been prosperous societies with capitalist corporations in them. But what you have not articulated clearly is that they have virtually all been under vaguely or explicitly social democratic structures in which the relation of capital does not dominate. From 1980 to 2020, the most economically progressive president of the United States was Barack Obama. Over that period of time, a huge array of countries on a huge array of measures caught or exceeded the American standard of living. Every single one of them was to the economic left of Obama, no exceptions. The most economically left president, everyone was to the left of him. Meanwhile, if we go back to those lionized mid-20th century economies that you're taking credit for, and I encourage everyone to open a search engine and fact check what I'm about to say. The status across the entire developed world had moved so far to the left that Republicans had an upper tax bracket on the rich of 91% to help pay for New Deal social programs and supported unions. And as we show, and even more revealing was the rhetoric. The Republican President Dwight Eisenhower got up and said anyone who didn't support those social programs and didn't support unions was what he called a tiny splinter group that he said were fools, that he said would take us back to the days when labor was an almost hopeless and helpless mass. By the 1950s, that was mainstream American conservative opinion. And as we shall see, as we get to the question of safety and security, that was for a reason. You cannot glean a consistent argument for capitalism off of this. You can try and argue capitalism helps produce revenue for the public sector, as you have. But in practice, we all know capitalists are always trying to destroy social democratic structures because they interfere with their profits, as they succeeded in completely dismantling New Deal America. And in theory, you simply cannot argue that the success of nationalized key industries, progressive taxation, regulated markets, robust unions, and vibrant cooperative movements is evidence that we need capitalist masters. That's not how evidence works. Meanwhile, as we get to the question of safety, we find that many of the most humiliating failures absolutely can be found in countries where the relation of capital dominated. Now, there is certainly a corporate media aesthetic, an artistic impression that capitalism has produced long-standing, stable prosperity, and that we've just had a few blips recently. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from Canadian poets to help break through that corporate media artistic impression. The first is from Leonard Cohen. That's how it goes, and everybody knows. There's the story we all have to go along with in our day-to-day life, and then there's the truth we all know underneath that story. The second is from George Eliot Clark, the great African-Canadian poet, from his collection Execution Poems. The line is, 10 years of depression and then Hitler. Now you all actually know that's where the leading liberal capitalist democracies descended. 10 years of depression and then Hitler. Something else you know, the Soviet Union, for all its faults, none of which I deny, did not come out of a leading liberal capitalist democracy. It came out of a czarist peasant society halfway in feudalism. Something else you know, the Soviet Union fell 30 years ago. It was replaced by a kind of capitalism, though you might not know the details, and something went wrong. Here are the details, which would be brought up every time if you were watching legitimate conversations. Through the 1990s, a radical form of capitalism, initially called libertarian capitalism, shortly before it was called gangster capitalism, was implemented in Russia. And we got the closest thing possible to a large-scale closed experiment between these two extreme systems. The entire West, bragging about winning the Cold War and defeating the Soviet Union, now got behind these reforms. Bill Clinton, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the G7, including Canada, supported Boris Yeltsin and his Chicago Boys economists, waving their books of Milton Friedman in the air, saying in 6 months the market would start to correct. In a few years, it would grow into the 4th largest economy on earth. And what were the results? Lest you think I'm giving a left-wing bias, I'll quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn, author of the Gulag Archipelago, Jordan Peterson's hero. People do not see, why live, why give birth? We are dying out. That was Solzhenitsyn under free market capitalism, when all through the 90s, it couldn't get in the ballpark of the Soviet economy, crashed further from Soviet levels. Then the United States crashed in the Great Depression, killed millions. The birth rate was so low and the death rate was so high, the Russian population was actually shrinking. We are dying out. This is how Putin came to power, by the way. In 1999, Yeltsin finally resigned with an apology for his naivete, while the independent Levada Institute found that 75% of the Russian population said they regretted the fall of the Soviet Union, primarily for the loss of the economic system, with the remaining 1% divided between those who did not regret it and those who were still undecided. Now, I think the Soviet system was a steaming pile of crap, as you say, Ben, but we need to be, unless we are going to be naive sitting ducks, fear-mongering in the wrong direction as we walk off a cliff, we have to acknowledge capitalism managed to do that much worse. Would you check that box yet? Prior to the 40s, capitalism produced the 100-hour work weeks and panics of the 19th century, 10 years of depression, and then Hitler in the early 20th. After unprecedented socialist reforms, social democratic structures produced the highest standard of living in the history of the species, by far, only to be exceeded by subsequent social democracies at the national level and at the local level by cooperative economies like the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. In the late 70s, early 80s, we started going back to right-wing forms of capitalism, especially in the United States. And we went back to systems of stagnating wages, ballooning household debts, spiraling inequality, monopolization of industry, and all the biggest crashes since the Great Depression, same as it ever was, same as it ever was, same as it ever was, with global climate
Please wrap up your final
as a
point.
sort of bonus. So parents, please understand that under capitalism, your children are not safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Ben, you have 10 minutes for your rebuttal.
All right. Thank you for that, Colin. Thank you, VJ. A couple of things. Just a few comments on what you just said. I appreciate your comments. Number one, with the Alexander Solzhenitsyn, sorry, it's a mouthful. Alexander S. In the Gulag Archipelago. That was written between 1951 and I think 1968 during the Soviet Union, not the 1990s period of Russian economy you were talking about. So that was in reference to the Soviet Union. And then with the Barack Obama, you mentioned that and how his economic policies brought prosperity to the world. Let's not forget about the market crash in 2008. And in that time, more jobs moved to communist China overseas in certain sweatshops and whatnot away from America, because companies simply could not sustain the wages and the government regulation that he brought on. And that overregulation costs people jobs, because most small businesses and most of these companies are not able to afford such taxation. And that's why companies like Amazon, like Microsoft, that you mentioned, that you say are evil, are in full support of the sort of mantra that you're saying, because they're able to afford all of this, all of these regulations, these increase in wages. They're able to afford it. Who isn't? The mom and pop store down the street. These small businesses, they're not able to afford like $15 an hour wages. They're not able to afford these certain benefits that socialism demands. And just be, and sorry, I'm just pressing a little. And again, the very things that you are mentioning that are benefit to socialism are only afforded through through capitalism. Because yeah, you mentioned Jeff Bezos a lot, and yes, he is a product of capitalism. But your argument seems to be that because he exists, because someone is that wealthy and accumulates that much wealth, that should be absolutely, that should be leveled. And I understand the argument, a fair share, because the person has much more than they need. But I don't think you understand the amount of work it takes to be a Jeff Bezos. He started straight from scratch. He took risks. He works like he has to manage a multi-billion-dollar corporation. That applies to all these big, these huge companies and individuals that you mentioned, the Musks of the world. I mentioned Musk. You didn't mention Musk, but Musk, Bill Gates, I guess Steve Jobs when he was alive. These people are profoundly wealthy and profoundly successful. Yes, you are right. But not everyone, they also do more work than anyone else. Look, again, I'm using Musk as the main example here in terms of what he can do. He runs Tesla, a company that makes fully electric cars. I don't even like how do you even make that? Like, I don't even know how you do that. Sure. Built a rocket company, SpaceX. How do you make a rocket? I don't know. He does. He put in the work. He knows what to do. So why shouldn't he be compensated for that, for making a successful rocket company? Like, who does that? He does. And he's profoundly rich for it. Sure. And the Boring Company, which is makes flamethrowers and railways, immensely complex. And he is immensely wealthy from it. And if you see videos of it, he makes a significant business decision every 5 minutes. I don't even know what I'm gonna have to eat or drink in every couple hours, let alone every significant decision every 5 minutes. So these individuals worked their butts off to get to where they are. Socialism doesn't allow you to climb that sort of ladder. Yeah, you get the money, sure, but what do you produce with that? Because Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates are producing the leaps and bounds. I don't really like Bill Gates, to be honest with you. But still, anyway, he made Microsoft and whatnot. Just because you like what he built doesn't mean you have to like the guy. Anyway, in leaps and bounds of productivity, to which socialism does not allow. So if you are able to produce the work that contributes to your community and society as a whole, I don't see it as much of a sin to be greatly compensated for that. Jeff Bezos versus a person working at a liquor store versus a person working as Sobeys or something like that. Just because these people, because it's difficult to be a CEO and to run a company. It's not like these guys are sitting on their butts and just, they're enjoying the wealth. Like, these guys are significant entrepreneurs and putting in the work. Not everyone should be that. Not everyone's built like that. You have the freedom to not do that, because of course you do. The amount of productivity they're able to produce is the reason for their wealth, not because of of selfish means. And yeah, I'll end it there.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Colin, for your rebuttals. Now we're going to move into the collective discussion, but I fear that we may not have enough time, so I want to structure the discussion if we can. We have some very interesting insights from the YouTube chat. So if you will allow me, Colin, I'll give you a few points that seem to be fairly good interrogations of your position. And Ben, I'll do the same for you. So Colin, if you will consider, perhaps it is disingenuous to attribute socialism to these successful market socialist countries, say in Scandinavia and the Nordic region. Could you make an argument that they are more capitalist than they are socialist? There are examples like Venezuela, which is a self-described socialist state, and it isn't particularly a good example of what you're arguing for. Another point that I found compelling from the chat was it is not logical to give a larger share of profits to workers. Profits are divided based on who shoulders the risk. Factory workers shoulder no risk, and therefore the owners of production shoulder it all. Do you think that there is not just a moral but an economic imperative to allow risk takers and entrepreneurs to have the profit, mostly because we want to embolden innovators to innovate? And how do you square the tragedy of the commons? Ben, the points that I think are very relevant to you, and I'm kind of summarizing here, so forgive me, but what you are describing, particularly as you mentioned Musk and you mentioned vaccines and pharmaceuticals, your points, in fact, center around massive government R&D. This is something that has been brought up before. Musk, for example, didn't actually found Tesla. He became a majority shareholder after the two founders left. He utilized NASA's R&D for SpaceX. And even the vaccines, mRNA technology would not be possible without massive state subsidy. So, do you think that there are limitations to capitalism, and how do you square some of the most successful capitalist economies and their use of state coordinated strategizing in the planning of their economy? So, I will open the floor to both of you, and you do not have to yield your time to either of you. You can just talk.
Sure. So to begin, can you just reiterate what the question was about Scandinavia, please, Vijay?
Is Scandinavia a truly an example of a socialist country? Are they more capitalist than socialist?
Scandinavia, the point that I was making was that Scandinavia, well, is not a fully socialist country, or a series of countries. They're not fully socialist. What they are much more socialist than people imagine. The state of Norway owns 60% of the wealth of the nation. The state of Denmark owns 50% of the wealth of the nation. 65% of the Scandinavian workforce is unionized, and cooperatives are very vibrant in those communities, in those economies, so that in Finland, there are more cooperatives, members of cooperatives, than there are people, because most people belong to most adults belong to multiple cooperatives, which are not a capitalist mode of production. They use markets, but they're not a capitalist mode of production. And the overall argument that I was making there, that I think Ben maybe mistook as praise for specifically Barack Obama, who I do have to point out, took office, whatever I think of Obama, took office after the crash of 2008 had happened. But the point that I was making was that only countries that have had robust socialist reforms would be counted among those, using Barack Obama as a sort of border wall, could be counted among those that we consider the most prosperous, healthy, happy, stable economies and societies in the industrial era. In fact, I would give capitalists every economy from Obama to the right, anytime in the last 220 years, and ask them to point out which ones are the ones that people would be flocking to move to, who are living in countries like a Scandinavian social democracy. Now, I grant you that those countries are not totally socialist, but I would say that the socialist things that are happening in those countries are wonderful, and that it makes it very difficult to get a consistent argument for capitalism out of those countries, because you can try and argue that capitalism produces revenue for the public sector, but we also know that capitalists are always trying to destroy social democratic structures in practice, and they've succeeded in destroying them en masse over the last half century. So that right now in Scandinavian countries, especially since the fall of the Berlin Wall, they're actually under all kinds of pressure to reform to the right, though it's very unpopular in terms of the public. There's a lot of economic pressure because of new outsourcing opportunities and the like. The second question was about risk, I believe. Risk.
Yes. So the shouldering of risk and where the profits go. Should it go to the innovators or should it go to the factory?
Yeah, again, the innovation, a lot of this is rhetoric rather than argument. A lot of the innovation did not come from the capitalists. I've already kind of outlined that. And I think Ben's going to try and respond to that, so I won't speak too much about that. A lot of it comes through the public sector.
You make your point. I don't let my weird and don't let my face deter you, please.
Okay. So a lot of that innovation actually came through the public sector, and then and this is really wonderfully outlined in Marianne Mazzucato's book, The Entrepreneurial State, which shows how the risks are socialized, the profits are privatized. The public is getting massively ripped off on these, and a lot of these corporations turn into the biggest tax dodgers afterwards. So we're handing this over. Consider Google, which is a natural monopoly created through publicly funded research and development, handed over to the private sector. The corporation doesn't even produce Google. The corporation has some people who do some programming for Google, but it is used as a natural monopoly. The inputs come from the users. So competition is not even good for Google because that would drag down its efficacy. The users are making Google exceed faster and faster and faster. And this was created through publicly funded research and development. In classical economic terms, this was called economic rent, unearned income. This is what Adam Smith was writing about when he talked about a free market. He defined a market as free from rent. The rentiers that the classical economists are trying to get out of the economy were monopoly capitalists, corporate bankers, and landlords. This was not an argument against a social democratic welfare state when they argued for free markets, easy taxes, and limited government. They were arguing that these rentiers collected unearned income and then bribed the government to create what we call crony capitalism and what Marx called the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. They own the enterprise, they own the government, they call the shots, and we take orders. And so this gets into this question of risk. The workers get fired. The workers get fired. There are bankruptcy laws for the corporations and for the corporate banks that are reaping economic rent off of these corporations. We know what happens when they crash the economy. After taking trillions of dollars of unearned income, what happens to them? The public sector comes in and bails them out. So this stuff about risk is rhetoric from back before the proper bankruptcy laws were created. It was true in 1810 that the capitalists took on all kinds of risk that the worker did not. But now the risks are almost completely socialized. They're not being taken on by the workers at all. They're not being taken on by the capitalists. They're being taken on by the workers, not the capitalists.
Ben, you go ahead.
Yeah, I'll speak briefly. I know we might. Is it okay if we go a little bit over time? I'll speak briefly. I'll speak briefly. So before I go to the questions, I believe VJ asked questions about the definitions. I'm not going to freelance this. I looked at this from Merriam-Webster. If you want to look up a different source, fine, but I'm just looking briefly just so we are clear on what we are talking about, and this isn't my shooting from the hip. So this is how Merriam-Webster defines capitalism. An economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decision and by and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. And then the definition of socialism that Merriam-Webster gives is any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of means of production and distribution of goods. So, just to get that sort of out of the way, and so that we have clear definitions. And Colin, do you want to refute those definitions at all?
No, collective ownership includes employee ownership and control of the means of production. So that includes things like the worker-owned cooperatives, the democratic enterprises, cooperative enterprises that I've been talking about through the debate.
So first off, I'd like to challenge Colin a little bit. You said that the risk and reward is both affects the worker and the owner. Don't let me misrepresent your argument, please. Is that about what you're saying, or could you reiterate that question, that sort of statement one more time, if you could, if I'm misrepresenting it?
The question of risk?
Well, the question of risk, because I think that's a fair point to bring up. If a worker messes up, maybe a bottle breaks, maybe some meat gets spoiled, but if the boss messes up, if the CEO or the manager messes up, a store goes under, and
the workers get fired, and
the
cooperative enterprise
get fired too. But what the employee does doesn't necessarily go up.
If you're a worker in an enterprise that fails, whether it's a cooperative enterprise, a democratic enterprise, or a capitalist enterprise, you're going to lose that job.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why if the manager, let's go, I won't even go as far as CEO. Let's say the manager of a Sobeys, right? Mm-hmm. So we got a manager of a Sobeys. If they mess up either an order or they don't turn around, if they don't turn around their goods, their product enough, and things go rotten, things go spoiled, they don't order enough, sales go down, that, yes, you're right. The store can go under, and then, yeah, all the employees are done. That is how that is addressed. If a worker fails, the company and the store is not necessarily at risk. If the employee messes up, meat gets spoiled. Like I said, the only reason I'm bringing up Sobeys because I worked at Sobeys, so it's kind of just it's how I know. You can use anything, a liquor store, a bottle breaks or something. That doesn't impact the store significantly as if a manager messes up. That's the question of the risk, not if the manager messes up, the employees are at risk. Right.
I understand what you're saying. You're saying that the higher up the food chain we go in an enterprise, the more responsibility there is.
Okay. Yeah. So, and then why should they not get more money than the worker?
Absolutely, great point. Fantastic point. Fantastic point. Let me clarify something. Yeah. Again, I am not against there being forms of inequality. I haven't argued against inequality. Mm-hmm. The executives on the Workers' Council of the John Lewis Partnership make way more than the average worker, but they're elected. Exactly what you said, a good job of providing good enterprise for the people who work in that enterprise. They're accountable to the workers. They're elected and paid way more as a result. Doctors are also paid way more than I'm paid. I have no problem with doctors making more than I make. LeBron James makes an absolute fortune as a good union worker in the NBA. I'm all for it, all for it. That's not people making huge fortunes off a division of workers and owners in which the workers are undemocratically organized from above to labor for the profits of the owners. That specifically is the kind of inequality that I am talking about, not inequality from people being really good at their job. I'm all for people making more because they're really good at their job. And the fact that people have more responsibility, as you said, means absolutely they should be paid more. Absolutely, 100%. But that's a question that should be evaluated by the people who are in that company. It's not just a question of those who are trying to get profits off the workers. That's a totally different question, utterly different stream of production.
Okay, so if I can interject here, I have a few questions of my own that I'd like to bring up. So, Colin, first off, in your conception of a perfect sort of socialist economy, from what the points that you've laid out, how do you get around the tragedy of the commons? The idea that if everyone has a stake in a company, no one really has a stake in the company. Entrepreneurs have that vested interest, and therefore executive decisions can be made more efficiently and more effectively.
Yeah, great question. So let me say a couple of quick things about that. First off, I'm not arguing for a perfect model of socialism. I don't think a perfect model of any system will ever exist. Society is always changing. So the point that you are bringing up here, and this is so important to understand because it is not discussed in the mainstream media. The point that you are making here is a point that market socialists, as opposed to planned economy socialists, would bring up. Market socialists would use exactly the same points that market capitalists advocate. If you ask a market capitalist or an advocate for market capitalism, how are you going to stop the capitalists from just taking the huge fortunes and not reinvesting them into the economy? Their answer is, well, you can choose not to invest, but another enterprise is going to come along and make the investment, make a better company, and wipe them out. It doesn't work so well for capitalism because you actually do get monopolies, and you do get problems like what we have in, say, Germany right now, or have for the last few years in Germany, where the demand is so low that the capitalists stop investing because they don't think people have enough money to purchase their goods. So they hold it, and you get a zero growth economy. So it actually works better for market socialism than it does for market capitalism. Then it's a question between what kind of socialism you want. You get people who sit there and say, hold on a second, we have natural monopolies. We have questions of opportunity, of equality of opportunity. Shouldn't that mean education and healthcare as a public right of all citizens if we're going to have equality of opportunity across the board? You get people saying we don't want things like housing to be completely commodified. And so you get a different kind of socialism up against market socialism. But there is actually not an argument there that is unique to market capitalism. That is a debate between different socialist factions, not a debate between socialism and capitalism.
Okay.
Oh,
sorry, Ben.
Jovi. No. To be fair, I've already asked. I'll ask Colin a question later. Go on.
Ben, I have a question for you now. So, given what Colin described, market socialism, generally speaking, do you have any objections to that? Do you have any objections to economies being devised with co-ops, with land trusts, community bonds, and so on and so forth? Or do you think that's getting away from the question?
Yeah, I suppose it is sort of getting away from the question because part of it is you're kind of getting muddled with, oh yeah, there's different kinds of socialism. Yeah, there's different kinds, and this one's, oh yeah, I know the one that ruined hundreds of millions of people in the 20th century, like starved them to death. Yeah, that's one, but this one's good. I suppose I'm just a little muddled on what exactly you mean, because like I said, as Merriam-Webster says, it is like with capitalism, it's a distribution of goods that is determined by competition in the free market. What that implies is that in a socialist society, a more socialist society, whether it be 100%, 60%, whatever percentage you want to go, there isn't as much of a free market and there isn't as much competition. And I suppose one question I would pose to Colin is, you can say capitalism may breed certain monopolies, but how is socialism impervious to these monopolies as well? I would argue that they would solely make monopolies if they're controlled by the government. And you can say whether it be the government. If you're saying that the market control, like you're saying market socialism, that the market controls what is and isn't a good company, then you're no longer talking about socialism. You're talking about capitalism determined by the free market. And what, so, okay, you're shaking your head.
No, and that's
How
not
is
even true.
socialism
That's not
impervious?
even true. That's not even true according to the very brief Merriam-Webster definitions that you gave. The
Sure.
definition of capitalism was private ownership of the means of production, market competition. The definition of socialism, if you want to read it again, was
Sure.
various kinds of collective and sometimes government ownership of the means of production.
So, okay, so I'll restate my question then. How is socialism, whether it be market or whatever other socialisms you talk about,
Yeah.
it's sort of a vague definition, but how is that impervious to, like, look, no, I'm not saying your definition. I'm not dissing you. I don't want that to, I'm not shooting shots. I'm just saying how then is, so if your big issue with capitalism, if one of them at least is monopoly, how does socialism combat that? Because from where I'm standing, I think that would only create monopolies.
Yeah, I mean, if you're worried about monopoly, then you would argue for a more market form of socialism, though I would point out that both capitalists and market socialists have to figure out what they're going to do about what are natural monopolies. A natural monopoly is when there's an instance in which it's unlikely that there can be competition. So one enterprise is in all likelihood going to take over that whatever that commodity is or product is. Like, for instance, a subway system. If you have different companies owning different branches competing against each other, no one can use it because it's not an integrated model. So in all likelihood, it's going to be one enterprise to take over that. The conservative answer, usually, or at least it used to be, that you're supposed to turn those into public utilities to protect the free market and keep it from turning into monopoly power. And back in the era of classical economics, you got a lot of people who considered themselves Republicans and conservatives who were setting out to break up monopolies through antitrust legislation and who were looking to expand public utilities to protect the free market. It's not necessarily an anti-socialist point at all, but if you're some school of socialism, whether it's market socialism or not, you still have to deal with what you're going to do about natural monopolies. And I think that the old conservative answer that you're supposed to turn those into public utilities to protect the free market is it's fine and dandy. I don't know what you're going to do if you don't. It's going to turn into some kind of monopoly. I would much rather it be a public utility than something that's being maximized in a rentier economy by a couple of people who are going to try and leech as much from that as possible and may leave a huge portion of the population out of the equation altogether, which we have seen many, many times.
So, Colin, just to summarize your point here, you're advocating that natural monopolies should be publicly owned.
I think that's true whether you're for capitalism or socialism. If you want there to be a free market, I think you have to deal with natural monopolies. Absolutely.
Ben, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily arguing that there shouldn't be public goods and that certain things. That's a argument in of itself. Whether what's a better form of things like healthcare or things like, if you said, public transportation, railways, what should be publicly funded, what should be privately funded. That's an argument we can make. But how do I say? Yeah, I'm just thinking what would be my response to that. Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I don't think that still addresses these certain monopolies, like how do I say this? So you're saying that these monopolies, natural monopolies, will come of their own volition, things like, sure, railroads, things like, what were you saying? Like parks, let's say, roads, that those should be government funded. Sure, I can dig that because it's things like transportation and they get to people where they need to go. But more what I'm referring to is like a monopoly. Like you claim that Amazon may have a monopoly. You may claim that maybe Walmart has a monopoly. I would argue that is only through capitalism and free market. And you talk about market socialism. So tell me again exactly what the difference between free market capitalism and free market socialism is for me and the audience. Just one more time, please.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to re-articulate what I was saying earlier, there are many different branches of socialism. What they have in common is that it's about worker control of production, the working class in charge of its own affairs, and the working class getting all the wealth that it produces. That includes democratic employee-owned companies and cooperative enterprise, as well as the public sector and grassroots organization.
Okay. Sorry. No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't interrupt. Go on.
No. So companies like the John Lewis Partnership, which has 85,000 workers, but they all own shares in the company and elect their division representatives to a workers' council. Those are the organizers of the company. That's a company that functions as a huge retail company, but it's an example of market socialism because it doesn't have a capitalist mode of production in which workers are organized from above to labor for the profits of the owners.
So would you then make the argument that it is because of the worker that the product, commodity, whatever it may be, like I said, you can say from a Sobeys or whatever, that the worker is the reason why that thing has value, or not? Maybe Sobeys is a bad example. Maybe a paper company or something like that makes paper. Is that what please don't let me misrepresent your argument. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, of course. I mean, anybody who's had participation in making that product is a worker on some scale. They might have very different jobs, but that's how the product gets made, of course, whether it's intellectual work or physical work.
I don't want to derail the conversation here, but because we only have 3 minutes left, and I do want to ask one final question. So, on the issue of natural monopolies, I mean, conservatives will agree that natural monopolies in public goods, more specifically, should be the purview of collective ownership, whether that's the government or an alternative form. National parks and whatnot. That being said, we live in a different world today. We have the Facebooks of the world, Google, these organizations, these companies that are monopolies but aren't so natural. Yeah. So I would like to ask both of you, if you can keep your answers short and pithy, that'd be great. What should we do about those companies?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic question. So first off, let's clarify what the problem with these are. The problem is that these companies are not producing these products. The reason Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook in his dorm room is because he's not such a brilliant entrepreneur. He created Facebook after MySpace using tools entirely created through publicly funded research and development. It's a platform. If you take Mark Zuckerberg, if you take the people out of it, there's nothing there. And this is true of YouTube. This is true of Instagram. This is true of anything that is digital platform oriented. What we have here are landlords. This is economic rent. These are glorified landlords. So they're collecting, the reason you tune into Facebook is because of the content that the people put on Facebook. That's what keeps it in, events and statuses and pictures. It's not Mark Zuckerberg doing that. This is economic rent. Classical economists would have said this is not productive work. These are not productive companies. That's extraction. So it's even beyond a monopoly corporation. Now you can look at which ones of these might be feasible in terms of a a employee-owned company. But in general, probably you're looking at things produced through some kind of public service, because I should turn it over to Ben, but the company isn't really producing these at all. They're platforms.
They still do make quite a bit of money though, and you like through advertising and whatnot. So it's not like they're solely a public commodity. And in some instances, they do act as more publishers, because it's not totally free. What I say is like it's not a total public commodity, because there are still rules and guidelines to those things, and that's with anything. So I see what you mean. But what do we do about them? I think one answer is to try, if you believe that that there is too much of a monopoly, there are certain things you can do, like invest in other companies that might try to compete with Facebook. As much of a monster as it may be, it certainly is possible to topple the monopoly if that is your issue on that. Yeah, so sorry, Colin, what were you going to say?
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I was going to agree with you that they're making a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so we're in the final stretch of the debate. Now we have about 10 minutes left before we wrap up. So I'm going to ask that you provide 5 minutes closing each. And then I also want to mention that we should be posting a final poll and pinning it in our YouTube chat. And while the two speakers are giving their final remarks, please fill out that poll. And at the end, we'll look at the results and see how they've differed.
Right.
So because Colin went first, Colin, you can have the floor.
Great. Awesome. I am not a utopian. I admit that utopian possibilities exist. According to the US Federal Reserve, 1% of one country has $40 trillion of accumulated wealth and growing fast. If anything like that kind of wealth production were to happen under democratic circumstances, it would be the highest standard of living the history of the world has ever seen by far. But I also don't really understand that kind of wealth. I don't really understand billionaires. I don't understand $40 trillion in the hands of 1% of one country's population. I'm still making student loan repayments. What do I know about billionaires? So I don't think about that. I ask myself two questions. After 40 years of global neoliberalism, 30 years after the Soviet Union fell so that it's completely taken over, most of the world is living on less than $7.40 a day, much of it on way less than that. Those numbers were very slow to progress, and those were the numbers before COVID. Jeffrey Bezos has $200 billion and growing fast after a divorce settlement. Are the principles of a democratic society better than the principles of one in which workers are organized from above to labor for the profits of the owners? And are the results of such a society in the short and especially long term likely to be at least as good? Because if the principles are better, and it doesn't require a sacrifice to uphold them, there's actually nothing to debate. Thank you.
All right, Ben, you have 5 minutes.
So briefly, just in case Colin, you didn't see it, VJ just asked you to post the poll. Yeah, anyway. So I'll end, I'll make this quick. Another UN statistic to bring up is that in the early 80s, the UN made what were called, I believe, the Millennial Goals. So from 1990 to 2015, they wanted to half the global poverty rate. They wanted to completely half it. And this was also coinciding with the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of Maoist China, where that left millions of people impoverished and starving. So, like I said, the goals were 1990 to 2015. They were 5 years ahead of schedule, and this was mainly due to these to a lot of it contributed to a lot of countries introducing more capitalistic means and free market and less socialism, because that accounted for a lot of where the poverty was. And as well, I think the lack of mention of the countries that went full socialist, and we can talk about full capitalist, where those might lead, where they might lead to market crashes, where they might lead some into unemployment. We can make that argument if you want, but in total socialist countries, left hundreds of millions of people starved to death, imprisoned, and left burned, basically. I think a lot of it is that we're looking at a forest, and we're focusing on the tree in the forest of capitalism. We're saying, oh yeah, this tree is dead, this tree is rotten, and it certainly has the potential to be rotten. We're working in a lot of outliers and hypotheticals, but the overall ecosystem that capitalism provides is overall healthy. Where you go into socialism, that sort of forest and ecosystem that's burned and uprooted. And like I said, I will bring up communist China, where you say they aren't socialist, even though most of their law and policy was based on Marxist theory, and same with Maoist China and Pol Pot's Cambodia. And it is only over the last 100 years through capitalism, free market, that we are able to see the prosperity that capitalism provides.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you to both our debaters, Colin and Ben, for sharing your time and preparing and offering an entertaining and interesting discussion. And I thought it was quite civil. Thank you to all the people who are viewing the debate, and everyone in the chat. The chat has also been very entertaining, and there have been a lot of smart people discussing some different aspects of the debate and many of their own sort of personal interjections. So that is much appreciated. I'll give maybe a few more seconds for people to finish up the poll. We ended on time. And I just want to say this is the first of, I hope, many systems debates for the 21st century. I'm hoping that everyone who's participated in the chat can stay connected. And when we have more of these, inevitably, we can have different representatives and we can discuss different ideas as a result. The capitalism versus socialism dichotomy is a massive paradigmatic debate. And I've tried to provide as much neutral moderation as possible, and I've learned a lot from the two speakers we have today. One thing that cannot be understated is the benefits of the last several centuries, really, of capitalist modes of production. It has lifted billions of people out of poverty and has led us to very important transformative innovations. And I thank Ben for highlighting that point. And Colin, I've learned about market socialism. I've learned that there are varying degrees of socialism and socialist adherence. And there are ways in which that we can build on the market philosophies that we've come to embrace with a more collectivist considerations. So I encourage, no matter where you ended up on this debate, I encourage you to read about the other side. And be open-minded as you go forward. So with that, we'll look at the results of the latest poll. Interesting. We have 75% of viewers in favor of socialism. So that has increased, I believe, It was 45%, something like that.
Okay.
So 75% in favor of socialism. But we also have an increase in those who are in favor of capitalism, about 21% in favor of capitalism. The second option was undecided. So, Ben, if there's anything that you can walk away with, it is that you have convinced a number of undecided voters in favor of capitalism. And then we have 4% undecided. So at least we have a bit more conviction in the crowd today. So I think that's a win for all of us. Thank you. Any sort of concluding thoughts before we wrap up at 6 o'clock?
I just wanted to thank you, Vijay, and thank you, Ben. You've both been such game for this from the beginning, and it's just been a privilege to go through this with both of you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Yeah. No, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vijay. Thank you, Colin. Thank you for having me on this. And yeah, no, thank you for everyone watching. And yeah, no, it was a pleasure being here.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great Sunday.
Thank you.